So this summer, Clara, my sister's girlfriend, gave me a book by Rebecca Solnit, Men Explaining Things to Me, and said I would swallow it. Rather than swallowing it, I read it slowly, chewed it bit by bit, essay by essay, as if to make sure I'd leave the best for last. Solnit's a small book, written in the best essays tradition. It's a starkly feminist book that, among other things, gave birth to the now famous term mansplaining, and it's a 10-year-old book published in 2014. Apart from the pure relish in a witty, melodious, daring account of a journeying feminist mind, the book spoke to me of something else as well. Although published less than a decade ago, it sounded as if it belonged to a different era, inciting nostalgic sighs for a time now gone. It is about the good old patriarchy feminists around the world cracked and fissured. It seemed that our struggles, the ones Solnit so deftly describes, were irreversible. Victories made could not be unmade. And so it seemed. But the world changed in the last 10 years. Now, you may wonder, what does this have to do with violence, or even more with ideologies of violence? My first claim today is that violence has to do with the world we live in. The violence is in us, is fed and nurtured by the bonds that world we are part of gives to us. I draw on Judith Butler, now and on many other occasions, who told us that we need a livable world in order to have livable lives. And lives are livable only if they are not exposed, or even stronger, immersed in violence. And we in this region know a lot about that. In other words, for a world to be livable, the bonds between ourselves and the world must not be violent. Do we know this world yet? Far from it. Can we make such a world based only on what we have known already? It seems that we cannot use the same violent tools that are at our disposal to create the prospect of a non-violent future. We need to do something differently now, accepting at the same time that the future is unwritten, because we now know that the victories made can be undone, that they have already been undone. In one particularly forceful essay, Rebecca Solnit evokes the words of another feminist mind who shaped us, Virginia Woolf's. In the early 1915, that is at the outset of the most gruesome war thus far, Woolf wrote in her diary, I quote her, "The future is dark, which is the best thing the future can be, I think." End of quote. There are two things I want to make us hear in this short sentence. First, the obvious. The future is unknown, obscure, dark. This is, it seems, the only decisive trait of what we understand as the future. And this is so, Woolf seems to tell us. If this is so, we should better take this strange and often frightening definiteness as the best part of it. Being in the dark means not to know, not to be able to set right what is forthcoming in advance, which gives us a strong reason to be fully in the present, in the now. The second thing we should hear from this diary entry is an almost shy "I think." It obviously relates a certain wavering, certain self-doubt, the only sure thing that the darkness of the future in fact brings, a certain who knows and who may ever know. Out of such an experience, Woolf dared to think, right then in the midst of it, as we may recall from her Three Guineas, of a world without war. The present, immersed in the Great War, gave her no reason to form such a belief, but the future, being dark, may as well incite her into wishing for a world right now, right here, which gives birth to a future now unknown, now unwritten, in which no wars would be possible. The future of which Woolf spoke came and went, and we here especially, and especially now, know that we are not yet done with wars. However, we feminists can and perhaps should strive towards such a world without violence, a livable world, which is, as of now, unknown, as yet in the dark. For sure, because violence and wars abound. This is why I want to focus on the previous decade. I will follow Roman, but I believe also others from the first part of the conference, and expand on what you have already talked about. That phenomenon known as anti-gender mobilization is usually related to the right-wing political organizing, sometimes bundled under the vague and too broad the term populism, which goes together with other terms not less vague, such as democratic backsliding, de-democratization, illiberalism, culture wars, polarization, post-truth, authoritarianisms of this or that color, etc., etc. And more often than not, populism ties in with religious fundamentalism. Religions, however, differ among themselves, and so do fundamentalisms. It seems that we need different approaches to Russian Orthodox and to US evangelical fundamentalism, which in itself has different guises in US, Brazil, and Bulgaria, for example. Political scientists have also shown that there are varieties of populism, so those employed in the Netherlands, Finland, or Austria differ from those in use in Hungary, Slovakia, or Poland. And in the gray zone of the Western Balkans, which is neither here nor there, populism has particularly elusive features, manifesting itself as a catch-all tactical tool, which we in Serbia know particularly well. Nonetheless, whichever terminology we decide to use to talk about the rise of conservatism, there is one recurrent aspect of it. The rise of conservatism goes hand in hand with a persistent, mounting attack on equality. My claim is that we deal with an attack on equality as such, not this or that type of equality. What is behind this attack is a call, even a demand, for an unequal world. A world of known and firmly established hierarchies in which everyone knows their place and does nothing to change it. In other words, it is a call for a world which is unlivable or less livable for all those for whom it began to be a bit more livable in the past decades. Gender, curiously, became the catchphrase of this call. A phrase that is able to catch and collect all the grievances that little or common men or people have. Gender stands for all the losses incurred on them. Let me give an illustration. In my village, some 70 kilometers from Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, poverty is raging. Many households have died out. People leave for wherever there is work for them, often for the West. Agricultural pensions are a laughable matter, health systems such that no one trusts in it, and people die in their 50s and early 60s. One draft can extinguish years of savings. And yet, gays marching in Belgrade is the issue that has, it seems, the greatest power to steer, frighten, and move them politically. Therefore, gender, that word that only a decade ago meant something only to a select few in gender studies departments and feminist movements, now functions, as Andrea Peto, who coined the term, said, as a symbolic glue. Now, we should always be wary with words. Gender here appears as something mixed up, or something that helps other things mix up. It plasters and cements them into one huge totemic or mythical something which erases from view the concrete pitfalls and hazards that befall all of us, common people. Gender is to blame. As gender is also always foreign, it has a UFO quality. It comes to us from elsewhere, conspiratorially sneaking in, threatening to change us, to take something essential from us, to turn us into something we are not. Gender is therefore, by definition, menacing. I mention definition, but let us not be deceived by this. Anti-gender campaigns are not about academic debates on the merits of a concept. One is not discussing how much and to what extent we are in need of gender, or how well it fits into whatever social, cultural, and political frames we have or may wish to have. Having been totemized, gender is much more than a term. Those who subscribe to anti-gender narrative want to have this monstrous gender totem crushed, annihilated once and for all, but at the same time, augmenting its superpowers and preserving its totemic qualities to conserve its menacing status. So today, gender is the most convenient scarecrow. I want to claim that this is not about this or that minority, even if there are some who would want to persuade us that they are talking exclusively of trans people or of LGBT plus people or of the newest construct of the third sex, social and pol, surfacing especially in some parts of the post-socialist world. It is about something else, about how society distributes worth to various types of humans, how it grades us and positions us according to this unchosen value, and how it petrifies these positions such that no one dares protest them without risking to be seen as aberrant, abnormal, queer, to remind ourselves of the history of this tiny untranslatable world. It is therefore not about this or that minority. It is about majority that rejects to be equalized with all others who claim rights to a livable life. In the last decade, the empire decided to strike back. This might sound pompous, but some exaggeration is in order because this is not a regular backlash, a counter-reaction and an attempt to push back those who have moved forward. We know that the backlashes were always there when feminists claimed certain victories, however small. Feminists were disparaged, denounced, laughed at 30, 40, and 100 years ago, because back then the empire was hardly chipped by those victories. But as I claimed at the beginning of this talk, at the start of the new millennium, real cracks were open, fissures and fractures could not be laughed away anymore. This time it is different. Anti-gender mobilizations want to put a halt to what a decade ago seemed as an almost irreversible march to equality. In the north and in the south, in the west as well as in the east, equality fatigue spreads. People are tired of so much equality, exhausted of their being expected to be politically correct. They now rebel against equality, which they claim is imposed, thrown on them through policies and elite politics. And here's a populism trigger warning. From Brussels, from Washington, from elsewhere, always elsewhere, as if equality can never be our own thing, something we want and strive for. There are two more important claims I want to make before coming to a close. These claims are directly related to what I began with, evoking Butler and Woolf. Let me begin with a slightly wavering proposition by Woolf, who was pondering about the darkness of the future, which is the best thing the future can be, as she said. At a time when such a sentence, even as a diary entry, seemed almost counterintuitive. Her present, the early winter of 1915, looked dire, and the past seemed directly involved in begetting such calamities. Although one could hardly hope at the very outset of the Great War that the future may look grand, it was only the future, and a dark one at that, unwritten by the words of yesterday, the words of total annihilation, that seemed promising. Precisely because it was unknown, because it was dark. Now, anti-gender mobilizations rest on an entirely different assumption. Their main trope is the trope of return, of a restoration of the world we knew, the world as it used to be, a good old world of a good old patriarchy. This is a good old world emphatically without equality, a world which is livable only for some, never for all. That empire strikes back means, in that sense, that the empire wants to bring us back to the light of certainty, to reiterate where everyone knew and was certain never to change it. Knowing one's place, being certain where one stands, who one is, may seem reassuring to some. From time to time, we all need clarity in our lives. However, this is not what the empire ultimately wants. The light and certainty sought after or fought for is about the certainty of limits, limits of what makes one human, what makes one a man or a woman, of what makes a family. For the Church, this certainty emanates from the Scriptures. In Catholic tradition, it is foiled in the Christian anthropology of complementarity of the sexes. In Orthodox, it is much less concealed, invoking the healthy patriarchal hierarchy. Both those who sign under religious explanations of what makes us human and those who do not also help themselves with the facts of biology. But these facts, more often than not, have equally mythical qualities to them. This world in which people know their place, in the clear parlance of the 19th century, is the world of stratification, that is class, segregation, that is race, complementarity, that is sexes, that never reaches the status of equality. Our inequalities are inscribed in our brains, the shape of our skulls, uteruses, and penises. Thus, my last point. The world anti-gender mobilizations want to retrieve, to return us to, is inherently violent and therefore unlivable. The empire is striking back not solely with arms, but also with the slow and steady undoing of the legal victories. Think of US, Russia, Poland, other parts of the world. With the rewriting of the, so it seemed, accepted scripts, making them unacceptable in the school curricula and in the public discourse, or to the contrary, making other scripts, some call them fascists, fully acceptable again. What makes such a world inherently violent has to do with the limits, with the arbitrary decisions, as history teaches us, about who is worthy of rights, of protection, of a livable life, and on which basis. Such decisions are not God-given or based in anatomy. They are political and they are inherently exclusionary, invoking the majoritarian right to define who belongs where, to define which position is a rightful one for each and every one of us. Thank you.